On behalf of the Lutyens Trust America and the Lutyens Trust in the UK, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on Lutyens Lodges, Making an Entrance. My name is Robin Prater. I'm the Executive Director of the Lutyens Trust America. Our panelists today are Oliver Cope and Stuart Martin. This webinar came out of side discussions during work on the webinars that Oliver and Stuart did for us on Lutyens planning and Lutyens elevations. Lutyens elevation lodges provide the first introduction to a home, and they serve a variety of purposes. As with most things designed by Lutyens, we found that the more we looked at the lodges, the more there was to discover. I've thoroughly enjoyed delving into this topic with Oliver and Stuart, and I hope you enjoy it just as much. Let me take a moment to introduce our panel. Oliver Cope received an AB from Harvard College in 1980, a Master of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design in 1985, and taught as a visiting assistant professor of architecture at the University of Cincinnati before establishing the firm of Oliver Cope Architect in New York in 1988. A comprehensive architectural design firm with a solid base of experience in diverse projects, the firm is especially strong in traditional design and classically American homes in a variety of historic styles. Widely recognized as one of the premier firms for traditional residential architecture in the New York area, Mr. Cope's work is featured in the firm's monograph, Oliver Cope Architect, City, Country, Sea, published by Triglyph Books, as well as he's also been published in numerous other architectural publications. Oliver is a valued member of the advisory board of the Lutyens Trust America. Stuart Martin first encountered Lutyens through the Patrick Nugent's TV program that coincided with the Hayward Gallery exhibition in 1981. He pursued his interest at Nottingham University, writing a dissertation on the development of Lutyens classical architecture and beginning his own solo visits to the houses when he could. In his subsequent career as an architect of country homes, Stuart has sought to combine his reverence for Lutyens' work with its love of traditional form and materials, with sensitivity to the varying context of our own time. He's been a member of the Lutyens Trust for 20 years and currently serves as a trustee and architectural casework advisor. Today, I'd also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be placed at a later date on our website and YouTube channel. If you have questions, please add them via the Q&A button on your screen, and Marcos Lutyens will hold them till the end of the webinar, and then they'll be answered as time allows. Thank you again for watching. If you're not already a member of the Lutyens Trust America or the Lutyens Trust, we'd love to have you join, and our website will be posted in the chat. So now I'll turn over to Oliver and Stuart.
Far away, Oliver.
Okay. So well, thank you, Robin and Marcos and Stuart. I think we always have a lot of fun doing these things. We have 40 slides plus or minus to get through, so we're going to move along fairly briskly. We're going to skim along and whet your appetites for a deeper dive. One of the things to be conscious of is that there are themes that we will keep returning to as we go along, and so you'll see them in a bit more depth. We're going to start with some precedent slides. There are a number of things here which I would guess Lutyens was aware of. He certainly didn't work in a vacuum. A couple of items here we know for sure that he was very, very much in awe of Richard Norman Shaw, and the gatehouse at Leeswood, shown here both in photograph and with the bird's eye perspective, show that he would certainly have been aware of the fun of entering into a complex through a gateway. I'll going to try and go back and forth here with Stuart. So Stuart, you want to comment on some of the others here?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to emphasize here is that, of course, we all know that Lutyens spent his early years cycling around Surrey and looking at the vernacular buildings there. Our example here is the Cressing Temple Tithe Barn, not from Surrey, but from Essex. But it's a very good example where the original cartway through the barn was something which Lutyens would have seen a lot in the local barns he saw in Surrey, and which, as we'll see, he clearly liked this feature and he adapted it a lot in his own buildings. I think also especially the pictures on the right, and in fact the shore piece, also demonstrate that architects often like to emphasize this sort of quasi-military, almost defensive aspect of these buildings, as well as their ceremonial side.
The one below and with the red roof, the Henry Hobson Richardson Gate Lodge for the Ames family in northeastern Massachusetts is 1881 and was widely published. And I think it's quite possible that Lutyens would have been aware of it. But it again shows that this is an item that was part and parcel of planning and entrances. And on the far left, there's a French hotel plan done by Ledoux for the Hotel Guimard. And I've always, since 1980, when I was first introduced to it, always been interested in the procession through into the court. And I think that for me, the graphic nature of the plan and the organization should be looked at in contrast with one of Lutyens' buildings, the Salutation. Should we move on to the next? There we go.
Okay. The next few slides, really, we're just going to zip through some of the themes that we'll see throughout the talk. So here is the gate at Great Maytham, where basically he's letting you know you've arrived. I don't think there's any doubt. Next. Also in these buildings and the layout, we'll count what we saw a lot in his internal planning, where he loves to introduce ambiguity and a sense of mystery and discovery. Next. Related to that is this idea, and like I said in the previous slide when Oliver was talking about the sense of sort of security and fortification, a delineated boundary with the outside world.
Yeah, and I'd also say that another theme that we'll see that was there and will continue is the idea that there's a certain symmetry that is then distorted.
Yeah, that's so true. And in fact, it's present here at this gate for the Salutation as well, where the gate itself is symmetrical, but the symmetry is offset by that little right-hand sash window. And again, at the Salutation, he used the entrance to the site to resolve a very complex challenge of how to get in from the town street.
Just to see before sorry, we'll come back to that one later.
Yeah, sorry. Want to say anything, Oliver? Sorry.
Oh, no, that's all right. We could go on with this one. I think we're looking at basic themes, and this one is interesting in particular because one, this enjoyment of the ambiguity, the kind of uneasiness about approaching some of his houses that we've referred to before happens here because this lodge does not give access to the house itself. It only gives access to a stable yard. So there's a kind of mental problem for all of us in approaching and realizing that, oops, that's not the front door. So
yeah, and also what he's done here is, I think, by using the white painted brick, he's kind of giving you a clue. He's letting you know you're close, but it's like you're nearly there, but you're not there yet. Next. Another thing that he does with these buildings again and again is he really plays up the drama of the threshold, that sort of compression and release from the outer world to the inner sanctuary.
And I'll point out a few things here that you'll see again and just be kind of alert to as we go. He loved this device of sort of raising the eaves, peeling back the vernacular to reveal a classical entrance. And he also employs these paired dormers and the very large chimneys that you get a glimpse of here. So keep your eyes peeled as we move along.
Yeah. And then also what we see in common with a lot of architects at the same period, the lodge buildings are often seen as an an opportunity to play games. And so things like the repeated cubic shape of these houses, where he's just having fun with the geometry, he can do that with a bit more leeway than he can perhaps in the main body of the building.
I'd also say that, just to go back to the gray walls thing again, he's creating the illusion that these buildings are identical and that symmetrical, but he hides the fact that there's building and program to the right and the left behind the walls. And we'll get into that in more depth later on when we get to the plans of this place.
And then finally, in this little nip through our themes, they also play a very important role in the overall approach sequence, which is so much of the part of the experience of these buildings. Okay.
Park Hatch was one of his very early buildings. I think he was only 21 when he created these. There's no view to a house beyond. They're simply an entrance, but they presage a fascination or series of fascinations that he had throughout his career. It's the relationship of building to wall and how the wall merges into the building. He is intent on the vernacular, but at the same time, he starts to introduce somewhat loosely classical elements, the colonnades you see on the side. And he pairs these overscaled chimneys that you see to the right and just a glimpse of and to the left there.
Yeah. Then, so a few years later, 1897, here he is at Bury Down in Hampshire, in the chalk downland there. And what we see here is an explicit demonstration of what Peter Imskip called his use of fictive fortifications, and Lutyens was clearly keen on the romance associated with castles. So this building definitely defends Bury Down House against the public road, which is hard up against the boundary of the site. It's definitely, I mean, to my mind, it's definitely saying keep out rather than come in.
Well, and also point out that this is the same lodge building, just shown coming in and going out, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's another thing we'll encounter a lot, is a sort of schizophrenic nature of a lot of these buildings between the outer and the inner elevations. And as Oliver was saying, you know, there's here actually it's intriguing because you've got formally paired elements in the turrets on the outside, and then the dormers on the inside are asymmetric about the gate, which is quite sort of willful, I think.
It's fortification on the outside and welcome as you're leaving.
Yeah, yeah, which is a strange thing to be welcomed as you leave, isn't it?
Well, be friendly.
I don't know if there's a joke in the fact that he's got two clock towers. The one when you're coming in that tells you you're late, and one inviting you to leave, but that will go.
Yeah, also telling you you're late. Yeah, so these are some of his best lodges, I think. This is Grey Walls, of course. And the thing that blows me away with these is apparently these lodges were not part of the original layout, but were added later for the Willie James family, who of course were his clients at Monkton in Sussex. Again, as Oliver said about Park Hatch, we can see here how the lodges grow from the walls.
Yeah, and I remain unconvinced that even though these may have been built later, I can't believe that they weren't part of his original conception of this place. So
yeah, they're absolutely seamless, aren't they? I mean, and also like we said in the introduction, the way that when you arrive here, there's no clue. You know, do you go right or do you go left? And I think he just loves that.
And if you go right, you end up at the garage. If you go left, you're going at the main building, right?
Yeah. And
you have to get right up to the nose in order to make that decision too.
Yeah.
I think we also, and we'll see it as we go to the next slide, he uses these lodges and it does it on multiple projects where it's the thing that allows him, maybe we should go to the next slide, to change the axis of approach. It allows him to bend it, if not break it. So you can see here how he's used it to reorganize the whole approach so that he can get the house to do what it needs to do in terms of addressing the adjacent golf course views, southern and western light. I also think it's interesting that the kind of triangular disposition of the gate lodges is done again in the almost triangular disposition of the entrance court.
Yeah, I think there's a really intriguing game going on here, which is, I think that once he'd been driven by the constraints of the site to adopt that 45-degree approach, then the whole layout plays games with whether buildings are orthogonal or diagonal to each other, because from when you arrive at the lodges on the outside, they all look like they're square onto you, and then when you pass through that second gate, of course, the inner lodges are actually set diagonally to that gate.
And Oliver, I can't get it out of my head that you think the center lodge looks like a face. So that's what I see now every time.
Yeah, well, there's that anthropomorphism, which I think he enjoys all the time, and we see it time and time again at his projects. It's part of his personal predilection. And I think you got in the right-hand slide that the engraving over the door there says, basically, I think the Latin is "I play, therefore I live," which is
Well, especially
fitting
appropriate since
for a
Gray Walls
golf.
is on a golf course, right?
Yes, the golf retreat. So,
okay. Yeah, so inside you can see what I was saying before about, so this is the plan from Weaver in top left, which is very handy. And the picture on the top right is showing buildings A and C. And what it also demonstrates is Lutyens' enormous skill in manipulating these volumes and understanding what people would see in 3 dimensions, because of course, Lodge A is much bigger and deeper than building C. But as a viewer standing there, you're unaware of it simply because of the perspective and the way the ridge of the buildings is made to mimic it. They match each other despite the fact that the volumes behind are different.
so one of the things about this one in particular, we're back to Nashton, but when you're looking at devices that he seemed to employ or deploy for various projects, here he is again peeling back his vernacular roof and brick wall to reveal these classical elements. It's not unlike, at a different scale, what we saw at Plumpton Place, for example.
Yeah, it's also it's the first emergence of another theme that we'll see, where he uses these very deep classical cornices over the opening. Here he's supporting them by expressed columns, which is a very grand treatment for quite a humble set of buildings, especially, as Oliver said earlier, they don't even lead to the house. There's also a use of quite a lot of, sorry. Go back, yeah. I think also we would say that it's it's quite an unresolved building. This, I think, is, for Lutyens, it's quite visually restless in terms of if you look at each half of it on its own, it's very definitely not symmetrical and only makes sense when paired with the other half of the building, the other side of the opening.
Yeah, it's always been curious as to why he didn't make more of a space with the stable yard, that other piece, which is the powerhouse. It seems like that would have given him a kit of parts that he could have made more out of, and I have no idea why he didn't.
No, and also it's quite handy seeing the plan at the top, where you can see that this lodge building itself has got no relationship whatsoever to the main house and very little relationship to the buildings behind it. It's altogether very unusual.
We hint at one thing that we talked about using this tool here. So I'm going to draw something. If you look at the front of the house, there's your entrance. And you'll find out if you look at some of the other webinars that deal with this in more depth. The approach that you think you have into this courtyard is blocked by a wrought iron screen. The main entrance to the house is actually here, but then you have to make a decision. Do I take this grand stair or this other really grand stair? And that when you've already decided, well, I'm not going this way, though you don't know for sure, but that's to the service end of the house and the kitchens. So he has this, takes great pleasure, I think, in putting people slightly on their back foot. I think he felt in his own way socially awkward, and maybe this is a way of channeling that and making a game out of it.
It's also almost like compression and release in architecture. You're uneasy, and then when you get to the main reception rooms, you're equally welcomed.
Yeah, unless of course you end up in the stable yard by accident.
Well, they might welcome you there.
True. Next slide, yeah. This is one of my favorite of Lutyens' entrance buildings, the gatehouse at Barton St. Mary, which is a house that isn't as well known perhaps as it ought to be. I think this is very beautiful, and we can see the influence that we saw from those tithe barns and stuff at the beginning here. And in fact, a little reflection of one of his earlier designs at Orchards with the dormer over the roadway in the middle. The gatehouse forms the start of a wonderful sequence at the entrance at Barton St. Mary, where, because again, the plot is hard up against the public road, it's very kind of defensive in aspect. But once you're through, the drive leads straight ahead of you and goes over the crest of the hill and then downhill. And there's a strong feeling that it's quite axial, and you sort of expect the house to be at the end of it. But when you've driven through, you're brought to a point where there's a circle on the ground and you have to turn left, because immediately ahead of you, the drive just morphs into a path where there's some steps down a bastion and a change in level. And suddenly you can see a big view of the countryside, which is very beguiling, but you're not actually going that way. You have to make a right angle turn, 90 degrees, and then you drive straight again. And then eventually you arrive at the rectangular forecourt in front of the house, where you have to turn right again to get to the proper front elevation and the entrance courtyard. So just as Oliver was saying just now in relation to Nashton, these buildings and the sequences they introduce are very similar to Lutyens' planning of the interiors of his buildings. And especially as you can see quite clearly on this plan that another much simpler option would simply to have had the drive from the road straight down the middle of that orchard, which is to the left of the body of the house in the plan we can see. Have you got anything to say on this, Oliver, or should I carry on?
Well, I think there are just a couple of things again to note. So if you look to the plans, and Stuart, I like your term drove wave, you'll notice the inflection of the walls. And that was a device that he used commonly. You'll see it on a number of other instances as we go. I would pay some particular attention to the hung tile on the wall, which is very similar to our shingles, but more durable. But how he handles the transitions here are things that you see often. And at the rear, he's done that thing that he does so well, which is to change the second story wall, creates that eave and peels back the main portion of the structure with the lower hips embracing it. So
yeah, it's very
thematically,
it's got a sort of stratified quality to it, hasn't it? Where the lower story being in the brick, whether it's left in the red or painted, and then the upper story is all in the tile, either hung or used on the roof. I think it's these beautiful kind of swept, hipped roofs. The building almost feels to me like it's wearing a sort of deerstalker hat. It feels very kind of protected from the weather.
Yeah, that's a terrific analogy. Yeah, on the front, we'll return to it again, but when we get to Plumpton, pay particular attention to how that is massed and how the sort of sheds on the end come down to the ground, whereas the hip roof continues on up the roof.
Yeah, it's very true. Okay, and then in absolute contrast to the sequence at Barton St. Mary, here we're at Great Maytham. I think probably the largest of Lutyens' Neo-Georgian designs, or Renaissance as he called them. And basically what happens here is you arrive at the public road at the bottom of the plan. The gatehouse tells you you've arrived, and you just drive straight up and get out and walk straight through. And there's only a couple of places where Lutyens does this. And it's quite uncharacteristic, actually. And I expect it came from the fact that he had to adapt an original early 18th century building in order to form the house.
I think, and I may be wrong about this, but I just noticed that with the entry of the house itself, it looks like there's the light beyond. And it's one of the few instances you would ever see Lutyens do a plan where you could go from the entry at the lodge straight through the front door and straight out into the garden on the rear side. So
yeah, yeah. And that said, of course, the lodge building, which we're actually looking at, does have many aspects in common with the other buildings. So if we go to the next slide, Robin. So this is the outside and the inside of the building. And as Oliver pointed out earlier, we've got those same re-entrant hipped roofs about the entranceway in the middle, and the way that the roof itself over the entranceway is given that little lift, its own sort of local sprocket. I think this is actually a much more interesting building than the main house at Maytham, albeit it's beautifully built and wonderfully proportioned. Lutyens is definitely having fun here that he doesn't allow himself to have on the main house.
he also is testing you to see if you're paying attention, because you'll notice that the front approach, and we'll see this other places as well, he uses in quotes, a more modern wooden sash window. And on the rear of the entry side, he's using leaded glass and a more, in quotes again, antique window, which are the casements. The dormer roofs are different on the interior side than on the exterior side. And
yeah, I mean, it's really intriguing, because when you're standing at the road, of course, the building is very harmonious with the house beyond. But of course, once you're standing inside and you can't see the house, he sort of allows himself that leeway, and the building definitely feels less formal and more deferential, which is contradicted, of course, by that socking great clock tower, which is almost a direct quotation from Wren's Chelsea Hospital.
Again with the clock tower, and I think that that'd be very interesting to get the dimensions of the cornice here and compare it to the cornice that's used on the house. It's hinting at the scale of the house, but I suspect that it's still larger than what was employed even at the upper eaves of the house itself. So
yeah. Okay. So this is, I think, another one of the real highlights of this subject. So, of course, the salutation was a wholly new house, but it was inserted within the town walls of a very ancient medieval town, a cinque port of Sandwich in Kent, in England. And the lodge was a modification of a pre-existing building that was situated on the western boundary of the site. And as we mentioned in the introduction, by positioning the gate here, Lutyens solved a very difficult and tight streetscape. And I think this feels to me like a resolution of the themes that we saw at Nashdom and Great Maytham, and has a delight which comes from its compression into actually a much smaller scale.
it's really interesting because the scale, this slide on the upper right gives you a sense of how dense the village itself is. And on the left, the site plan, you see how open and generous the site is. But by moving the gate as he has so that it centers on this complex sort of three-way intersection, he gives space for any kind of carriage or car to get in. Whereas further down the lane, it would be quite difficult to turn in and have an axial entrance directly on the front of the house. A couple of minor things, you'll see the inflected droveway that we talked about seeing before, and we'll see at Orchards as well, though it's not part of a proper gate lodge. And the bent axis approach, where you're lined up on the garden and then you have to turn to get to the front door of the house.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that, because it's sort of related to the Grey Walls idea, isn't it? Where at Grey Walls you had to make a choice, and here, if you actually didn't make a choice and continued straight on, you'd find yourself walking into the garden and missing the house entirely. Anyway, yeah, so these are some pictures of the inside of the building, which I think is, for its date, 1911, is shows that Lutyens could still play his picturesque arts and crafts cards just as well as he could earlier on.
And you've
Bearing
got
in
the
mind,
whites. Sorry.
yeah, no, I was just going to say, you know, that he's added what are probably the most picturesque parts, with the little turreted dormer with the vent in the side and the large cat slide roof to the left of the gateway. Sorry, I've done.
No, it's quite all right. Sorry. The white sash, the wooden sash are on the exterior again, and he's reverted to the casements again on the interior. So
Yeah. Yes, it's very adroitly handled, isn't it? Because some of the classical detail kind of sneaks in, where the cornice from the outside of the entranceway, which we can see here, you know, it resolves itself so beautifully around the dormer windows, with basically vernacular detail, but he makes them into sort of classical bookends and relates them back through, and uses that, for instance, that tiled windowsill, 2 courses of red tiles, which then run and meet exactly at the point of the top of the gate, and the molding of the impost on that pilaster. Yeah, I mean, it's all beautifully handled, and internally, the top right photograph shows how he implies pilaster columns either side of the entranceway internally, when the rest of the game internally is mostly vernacular.
exactly.
This is another one that's probably not very well known. At Felbridge, in the middle of the First World War, Lutyens was approached by a guy called Henry Rudd, he had a company that made the Lewis gun, which people may have heard of, and he got a big contract with the British government, and he bought Felbridge expecting that he was going to make his fortune, and fairly characteristically, the British government reneged on the deal, so ultimately Rudd didn't get to build his house, but a start was made, and these 2 buildings, which are circled on the plan, were originally the stables and kennels for the house, which was obviously a great big building shaded in black on the plan. And they were related diagonally to the circular turning area in the forecourt. They were originally, like I say, they faced each other in a manner a bit like we saw right at the beginning at Park Hatch.
I think that one of the things that Stuart pointed out to us, which is just terrific, is if you look at the far right-hand corner, and we probably have another picture of it in more detail, you'll see that the pilaster at the end of the building is inflected. It's starting to turn. If you look at the site plan, it shows that there was the idea of a colonnade continuing in a kind of apsidal shape that you would have moved through. Quite a grand gesture. These are all that there is of that potential. There it is on the right-hand side.
Yeah, exactly. So you could see that the colonnade would have just kind of, again, like we were talking about how the buildings often emerge from the walls, the colonnade would have blended with the face of the building. I think these are, again, at this period of his work where Lutyens was working on Delhi and only just prior to being asked to start designing things like the First World War memorials, you can see how there's a clarity and a purity to the classical handling. And then he sees no problem with applying that to what's actually quite a rustic feeling building. You know, that stone slate roof, which is Horsham slate, which is appropriate for the area, and the local stone, which is the same stone that Lutyens used much earlier at Little Thacombe, doesn't really take fine detail very well. So there's a great contrast between the rusticity of the roof and the stone walls and the fineness of the carving of the classical elements.
It's almost, you can see a connection between the later shelter buildings and the memorials.
Yeah, I think there's quite a strong thing there where, again, I think in most of Lutyens' work, you can sort of see the seeds of what was to come later in the earlier work.
And for me, we've talked about it, there's a kind of Sonian aspect to some of the abstraction and proportion that he's using here. And
yeah,
you came up with this is terrific.
Yeah, well, I think this is quite a well-known building of Stone's. He called it his barn alla Paestum, where of course there are those wonderfully preserved Greek temples in southern Italy. And I just thought it was an interesting comparison where basically you're giving quite uh, a scholarly classical treatment to what's normally treated as a very basic functional rural building.
And there was, and Robin, you'll have to remind me or Stuart, but is it Mel's Park, which has a sown stable? There was a
Yes.
fire,
Mm.
and then Lutyens did a later house, partial
Yeah.
restoration of the house. He was alert to that house and the people who had it prior to doing the work there. Is that correct? But he might have
That's
known
right.
about it in the scheme of things here. So
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Do you want to go on this, Oliver?
well, okay, so this one's fascinating to me too. First of all, and Stuart, thanks for highlighting in blue here. You have the paired lodges, and an axial entrance to the house, no bent axis here again. But then he does this very clever thing, at least in plan, it wasn't completely realized, but he paired two more houses in the garden, small apple houses, and then another sort of house folly in the garden. It seemed to me that this is him showing that, that the whole that French school of garden planning, Vaux-le-Vicomte, things like that. He was perfectly capable of coming up with a very complex and ordered at the same time landscape. In this one, the section below is also really interesting because it shows that as you process through, you're looking over and you don't immediately see this recapitulation of the geometry of the entry lodges and the main house, but you discover it as you get to the end of the garden, the main garden level. So just
Yeah,
more
yeah.
fun.
I mean, I was just going to say that, of course, because Felbridge, the project was aborted, the house was going to be quite a sort of tall stone slate roofed, quite French looking building. And quite a lot of the ideas that Lutyens was kicking around for Felbridge, he ended up using at Gladstone. Uh, yeah, look, that's such a great picture. So, of course, the inclusion of the two lodges gives a scale to the whole place that if you imagine this photograph without them, the house would feel significantly reduced, I think, because it's not, and by most people's standards, it's not enormous. It's not a stately home, but it feels like one. I think it's only got something like 7 main bedrooms. But again, you can see how the lodges grow from the courtyard walls. And in fact, this photograph is taken, the eye level of the photograph is exactly at the datum level of the coping of those walls, which is extended across the buildings as a form of string course, which picks up the head of the window and of course merges seamlessly with the moldings of the pedimented doorways. In fact, in the whole place, the only features that interrupt that horizontal datum line are the columns of the portico itself.
Stuart, we haven't talked about this, but I have a question. What do you think of the iron fence and the way it subdivides the entrance court from the start of the entrance sequence?
Yeah,
Was
yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think it does because it's just a direct route. Perhaps it gives that sensation of sort of changing phase, even though you're not changing direction, but there are perhaps there's a sensation of progressive layering of security there.
Yeah, I wondered whether he'd ever, if they discarded the idea of having the walls come across and making the courtyard more defined and more enclosed, which would have been consistent with some of the things he's done, but decided that the transparent screen was important to your earlier point about raising the importance and scale of the house to something perhaps even bigger than it really is.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's, when I'm like many years ago, I did go to Gladstone, and when you arrive and you get this view, it's got real impact. And then when you go in, of course, what does send you off axis is the turning circle of the arrival, which obviously isn't perceived in the viewpoint in the same way as being physically turned and the view taken away. But of course, there is that small moment where it is taken off axis.
And there's a relationship with his design for the Theosophical Society headquarters, which became the BMA. It got that courtyard with the wrought iron gates across it.
Yeah, I can't actually remember, but if we went, we probably haven't got time. But if we went back to the plan, I think the line of the iron screen is shown, and it basically forms what looks like it's very nearly an implied square in front of the house. I imagine if you took the line of the screen and the line of the portico, that shape where the circle's sitting is probably a square.
Which is exactly what he did at the BMA.
Yeah.
There's the anthropomorphic face that he uses so often. You've got the two eyes in the mouth.
Yeah, and again wearing a very nice stone slate hat. And yeah, I mean, I think that we included this really just to show the enormous amount of attention and design that went into these supporting buildings. I mean, every course of stone is designed and dimensioned here. And we've got a lovely detail of those sadly unbuilt apple houses that would have formed part of that reiteration of the plan that Oliver pointed out earlier. I like the contrast between the austere areas of the bare stone and then the sort of slightly more rustic texture of the stone slate roof. Okay.
Stuart, this is your place. You've had the joy of working here, right?
I have worked. Yeah, I have worked here. Yeah, one of the. I mean, this is Lutyens' last job for Edward Hudson, his friend and patron. Hudson bought Plumpton Place in 1927. I was looking it up in Pevsner, and Pevsner calls this an enchanted place due to Lutyens and rare birds, which I really loved. And again, it's I think that in this last project together, they really set out to romanticize it and emphasize the antiquity of the place. When they came across it, the house was not fully moated round as it is now. It actually sat on a sort of promontory, and there was a sort of overgrown weedy lake to one side. And Lutyens made it into an island, which is only accessible by footbridge. And the bridge itself is only accessible on foot through this narrow doorway. It really is a doorway rather than a gateway, and it's treated as such in its classical design. And I think that at this point where perhaps Lutyens was more aware of the incursions of the modern world, he and Hudson definitely sought to physically distance the house and emphasize that it was of another time.
I think it's just here. These are. I think these are architectural morsels. The care and attention to the detailing around this just never ceases to amaze me.
Yeah, I think that it's very interesting. I think you commented when we were talking before, Oliver, about the treatment of the corner with that extended plank and that very unusual but entirely characteristic sort of profile that Lutyens has given it. The way it actually tapers outward as it goes up, which is counterintuitive but entirely successful. I think the other thing to say is that even with the treatment of these, you know, they're ostensibly vernacular, these buildings, but there's no detail allowed to go astray. I think in one of his letters, Lutyens once said, in classical buildings, no stone can be allowed to slide. And you know, when you look at these, you think, oh, there's a beautiful weatherboarded house on a brick base. But of course, there are no half courses of brick. There are no half boards. You know, everything is precisely worked out.
And I think we saw that with those apple houses, that the stonework and the coursing, it's almost a module which governed everything that happened, and it tied the whole composition together. This is what I was talking about before with Barton St. Mary, the image on the right, where you see the sloping shed to the side, and then the hip resolves the main volume. It's also that whole toolkit again of the paired dormers, the lifting of the eave, the revealing of classical detail. It's
Yeah. And it's also got that same thing you pointed out earlier as well, where the outside has the painted sash windows and the inside has the leaded light windows. And of course, that's again, when you're standing in the porch of the house, you look out and you see these very consciously antique in their treatment, these buildings, harmonizing with the general atmosphere of if you like, tranquil undisturbedness of the whole place, and suggestive of evolution over time.
I love this image because there's so many things about it that I think are worth noting, but I know we're running up against shortness of time. You got to note that there's the footbridge between the roses in the center. The scale of the entrance doorway here, which you can tell is really quite small, and it alerts you to the fact that the classical sort of Serlian Palladian doorway is also, the scale of that is quite small. One of the things, having been to Gray Walls, luckily enough, that has always impressed me is that the photography in, say, the memorial volumes or elsewhere implies a kind of grandeur to so many parts of it, and yet the actual scale of the pieces themselves, the spaces, while the detailing is exalted, the spaces are remarkably human and home-like. So this just
Yeah, all the country life photography was done from a worm's eye view on purpose to make it look larger.
I think this might be our last house in Middleton Park. Not quite Lutyens' last house, of course, but one of his very last houses. Built on the site of an earlier house. And as you experience it today, you drive in through the original Georgian gate piers, which are at least, I'd say they're a quarter of a mile, maybe half a mile away from these buildings. And so you've been driving down this, what feels like a country lane, and then the trees suddenly part and you get your first glimpse of what looks like a sort of small village coming up. But of course, you know, having seen what we've seen earlier, we now know what we're looking at here. And this is the inner two of the lodges, which are shaded blue on the plan on the right. And there are, believe it or not, there are four lodges here to this house. Okay.
So here's the wall yet again, part of his toolkit. What's really interesting to me is how the wall continues across the front entry side of the house, and they've abandoned anything but the major entrance and a couple of convenience doors for service point. But there are no windows on the lower story here. And then you'd see the garden where it's nothing but fenestration. It's completely dominated by windows and view. So I think,
yeah,
here's the wall peeling back again.
Yeah, exactly. So on this photograph, that datum level of the wall that Oliver was talking about is the line that Robin's indicating with the cursor now, which is basically the sill line of the upper story windows. And we can see that that extends right way across the face of these buildings and includes the entrance gate in the middle. There's a very beautiful handling of the planes of the walls here. I feel like there's a sensation that these buildings are sort of comprised of onion-like layers, which are sort of successively kind of peeled back, giving that delicious sensation of those Gibbs surround doors, which, because of the layering of the masonry, they feel like they are flush with that outer layer and then sort of pressed in against the inner layer rather than projecting forward of the wall plane, which would be what you normally see.
You can, on the right-hand side of this image, you can see, it's a little in the shadow, but you see how the wall comes and engages the house. We've seen so many times, but he doesn't allow for putting any kind of windows or openings in that wall to sustain the idea that this is an enclosure. I think, Stuart, you said that the tall windows or doors on the left, which is really into what I think was a garage, were a later addition. So the idea would have been stronger if that hadn't happened there. He does obviously allow it to happen with the lodges.
Yeah,
But,
I think that's absolutely right. And also, what's in contrast to that, of course, you've got that very strong idea of that wall, but then in the lodges themselves, we do see something which we've seen again and again in these buildings, which is that their interior aspect is much friendlier than their exterior aspect. So we have windows on the ground story. The windows are treated with shutters, which again makes them feel much more kind of domestic and homely. I think the other thing I really love about these buildings is the way that they are the same idea, but because of Lutyens' love of three-dimensional games, there's a liveliness here. There's we've got that alternating 2 and 1 dormers pattern in the roofs. And we know from the plans in the memorial that the buildings seem square, but they're not quite. So the chimneys at the top, you get alternatively the slightly narrower than the broader face of the chimney, which is also alternating with the 2 and 1 rhythm. So he always gives us these amazing kind of interlaced patterns which repeat but don't create they're kind of interesting patterns but not boring repetition.
yeah. This is again is he's testing, he's setting you up for what did you think you were seeing and what is really there and how does it change? It goes back to the changing from the dormer configuration, I think, at Great Matham for inside and outside there too.
Yeah, exactly. It's that whole oh, here we go. Here's our themes. That's nice. Do you want to go? You go on it.
Sure. Well, okay. So I've loved these inflected droveways that we've talked about. So here you've got entrance to courtyard image of orchards. That little dormer that's just kind of a third eye poking through the eave that he uses at Bury Down off over on the upper right side compared to the upper left. You've got this barn, which I've always thought Gertrude Jekyll probably dragged in there when she was working on her book for Old Surrey. And you've got the buttresses, you've got the driveway, you've got the hip roofs, you've got the roofs coming down to the ground, you've got the brick base and the timbering above, things that he fell in love with, I think, and used as part of his vocabulary.
Yeah.
Stuart?
Yeah, I just say the thing that strikes me again and again is that he takes these vernacular and historical inspirations and ideas and just totally makes them his own. There's just no question about it. It's there in the tilt of the roof, the pitch of the sprocket, the angle of the moldings, right the way through to the thickness of the glazing bars or the choice of material. It's remarkable.
And here
we just
go
want
ahead.
to bring the themes of the planning together and emphasize how what we saw at Great Matham in the top left and Gledstone in the middle right, that straight axial approach is definitely the exception rather than the rule. In general, he likes to enrich and complexify the approach so that it's very unlikely that you're going to just drive down a straight road and arrive at the front door.
I think he only used the straight on approach when the monumentality of the house sort of made it possible. But all of these others with the bent axis, he used it to get the house to face the way he wanted it to face and address sun and garden spaces and things like that. It was a way of freeing what you have when you from the street and the way you might need to enter, and then what you want to do once you're into the site. And he did it so cleverly in so many different ways. And I love that at Plumpton, he keeps the cars completely away and uses that same device down on the lower left.
Yeah. I think that's it.
I think we've used up our time.
You have. That was wonderful. I think we have some questions on the side, so.
Yeah, hi. So there's a note from Fred Bland. Just a hello to Oliver, with whom I worked so long ago when he was at Bayer, Blinder, and Bell. I can see a smile on Oliver's face.
Hello, Fred. I always enjoy seeing you or hearing from you. He gave me a good start down the road.
Fantastic. David Pearson, just an observation, Roman city gates had an external rural side and an interior city side that were decorated accordingly, like the Lutyens gates.
It's interesting.
And Tim Skelton, hi Tim, thanks for all your help with the Gazetteer, by the way. Aerial views of Nashtam show a complex of buildings behind the gatehouse, which makes sense of its design and position. Do you know if these were designed by Lutyens?
We were talking about this in the run-up, weren't we? I think, Robin, you know more about Nashtam than I do.
I think at least some of them were. He put a at the end of the powerhouse, he's got a little niche thing that's based on a Wren, something Wren did that's now in Kensington Gardens. So he definitely had an impact on those.
I mean, my instinct is that L-shaped stable building that we saw on Robin's plan for Nashtam, I suspect that was a pre-existing building that Lutyens modified, and then had to make sense of its slightly strange relationship to the junction in the country lane close by.
Then there's another note from Tim Skelton. The gates at the BMA were added later as a war memorial.
Right.
Ah.
But by Lutyens.
And then from somebody else, are these see-through island-like lodge entrances typical of UK Lutyens only, or also present in other European architecture of the time?
That's a good question. I think that there's definitely a tradition of lodge buildings that aren't specifically British. Oliver had on the precedent slide, he had the Hotel Guimard, and certainly at the entrance to Grand Estates in France or the Low Countries, you'll often find, yeah, exactly.
So this is the product of Paul Hamas and Coffin, who were American architects practicing in the early 20th century, but going off like so many did on grand tours. And the books are full of examples of lodges and that kind of thing. So.
Okay, we have a final question, which maybe Robin can answer. Do you have any intentions of doing a tour of these Lutyens lodges? Would love to stay in one and then tour around visiting other Lutyens masterpieces.
That would be amazing. We've actually done a tour where we went to Greywalls and stayed, and we've done another tour where we were in Nashtam. So we've been to both of those places. Some of these are very private homes that we're just very lucky to visit by way of the webinar, but we're always looking for new places to go. So that's a great idea.
Maybe you could also just mention that there's going to be a tour in coming up in June.
Yes, we're starting in June. We're looking at arts and crafts, architecture of Edwin Lutyens and his contemporaries, and very excited to see some of the new Lutyens places we haven't been to, and then kind of juxtapose those with some of his contemporaries like Boise and some of his predecessors like Philip Webb. So looking forward to that.
Yeah, and if you're interested in a tour of the Lutyens Trust America of UK buildings, or maybe other places as well, just check in with us. I put the links to the Lutyens Trust America website and also the Lutyens Trust that also do tours and lectures and things like that. So I think we're gonna round things off now, and thank you very much, Oliver and Stuart, for such an amazing webinar. And so any last comments?
Join the Lutyens Trust America and the Lutyens Trust.
Thank you for sending us off on this really terrific little trip that we made today. So I appreciate the opportunity, once again, to collaborate with Stuart and all of you.
Yeah, it's really good fun. The more you look, the more you see.
And thank you to everybody for listening in. Bye-bye.